I'm Charles, a 32-year-old guy, married to my 28-year-old wife Kathy, and we've been together for 2 years now. Things between us have generally been great. She's supportive, kind, and we make a good team. But recently, there's been a growing tension with my mother-in-law Karen. She's always been a little intense, always wanting to know what's going on in our lives. But it wasn't too much of a problem until recently. My wife and I just bought our first house. It's a modest place, but perfect for us. The thing is, we managed to buy it without any help from my mother-in-law, and that's where things started to go downhill. She didn't seem to take it well when she found out we'd made this big decision on our own. I think she felt like she should have been more involved or at least consulted. She kept making little comments about how family is supposed to stick together and how it would have been nice to be a part of the process. But we shrugged it off, thinking she'd come around eventually. Once we moved in, we decided to set a boundary with her. We didn't want any unannounced visits. It wasn't anything personal, just that we were enjoying the new space and wanted a little privacy. When I first told her, she seemed to understand, but I could tell she wasn't thrilled. There was this pause, and she gave me this look, but she eventually said, "Okay, if that's what you want." Well, a few days later, she showed up unannounced. My wife and I were still in the middle of unpacking when we heard the doorbell ring. I opened the door, and there she was, holding a big box wrapped in bright paper. She smiled and said she'd just come by to drop off a housewarming gift. I reminded her of our talk about giving us a heads up before visiting. She laughed it off, saying she thought it wouldn't be a big deal since it was just a quick stop. I kept it polite, but I made sure to bring up the boundary again. She looked a little annoyed but left without any further comments. After that, I noticed a shift. My mother-in-law started making passive-aggressive comments whenever we spoke. Things like, "I guess you two have your own little world now," or, "I wouldn't want to intrude on your new life." At first, I tried to let it slide, but it got under my skin. My wife reassured me that we were doing the right thing by keeping some space, and she said she'd talk to her mom if it got worse. I appreciated the support, but it was clear that this situation was starting to get uncomfortable for both of us. Then came the family dinner. My wife's family likes to gather every couple of weeks, and this time, my mother-in-law brought up our no unannounced visits rule in front of everyone. She joked about how she wasn't welcome at our place anymore, how she had to make appointments now. She said it with a smile, but the tone wasn't lost on anyone. It was one of those moments where everyone laughs awkwardly because they don't know what else to do. I just sat there, trying not to make a scene, but it was pretty clear what she was doing. Not long after that, my mother-in-law tested the waters again. She showed up unannounced for a second time, this time with a tray of my wife's favorite homemade dish, something she used to make all the time when my wife was growing up. She smiled and said she just wanted to bring back the good old days. I could see my wife's face, caught between appreciating the gesture and knowing that this was another boundary test. I had to be the one to remind her of our rule again, which felt like déjà vu. This time, I was firmer, telling her that we appreciated the gesture, but that it was important to us that she respect the no unannounced visits rule. She didn't take it well, and her expression changed fast. She left pretty quickly, and I could see the frustration all over her face. The next day, my wife got a call from my mother-in-law, who was in tears. She told her that I was being unreasonable, that I was trying to push her out of our lives. She said she felt like I was controlling everything and that it wasn't fair. My wife tried to calm her down, but she didn't give in to the guilt trip. She told her that we both made the decision together and that it wasn't about shutting her out. I could tell my wife was stressed after the call, but she reassured me that we were in this together. Then came the silent treatment. During the next family gathering, my mother-in-law barely spoke to me. She talked to my wife, smiled sweetly at her, but I got nothing more than a quick hello. It was awkward, to say the least. I didn't know whether to try and make conversation or just let it be. The rest of the family didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't mention it. My wife noticed, though, and I could see it was bothering her too. Things kept escalating when I found out that my mother-in-law had been talking to other family members behind our backs. I heard through the grapevine that she'd been telling people I was trying to isolate my wife from her family, that I didn't care about their traditions. It made me look bad, and I knew I needed to do something about it, but I also didn't want to cause a bigger scene. It felt like we were caught in this trap where, no matter what we did, we came out looking like the bad guys. The final straw came at another family event when my mother-in-law made a pointed remark about how some people just don't understand what family means anymore. She didn't say my name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. I looked around, and some of the relatives were nodding along. It felt like she was turning everyone against me, and I knew I couldn't keep letting it slide. I had to address it or it was just going to keep getting worse. That's when I decided it was time to sit down with her and have a real conversation about what was going on. I wasn't looking forward to it, but I knew it had to be done before things got even more out of control. Update 1. I decided to bite the bullet and talk to my mother-in-law directly. The passive-aggressive comments, the tension at family gatherings, and the rumors she was spreading had all become too much. I figured that if we could just sit down and have a real conversation, maybe we could clear the air. So I reached out to her, suggesting we talk privately. She agreed, and a few days later, I found myself sitting across from her in our living room. I tried to start off on a positive note, explaining that the boundary about unannounced visits wasn't about keeping her out but more about creating some space for my wife and me to settle into our new home. I wanted her to know that it wasn't personal. But she didn't seem interested in hearing me out. Almost immediately, she cut me off, saying that ever since I came into the picture, everything had changed. According to her, I had turned my wife against her and made her feel like she wasn't welcome anymore. She went on to bring up things from way back, like how she didn't feel involved enough in the wedding planning. She said that we hadn't asked for her opinion on the catering or the guest list, and that it was clear we never wanted her to be a part of any important decisions. It was like she'd been holding on to every slight, real or imagined, since the day we got engaged. I tried to apologize, saying that if there were any misunderstandings in the past, it wasn't intentional. I wanted to focus on the present and why this boundary was important to us. But she wasn't having it. She shifted gears, accusing me of manipulating my wife, saying that they used to have such a close relationship before I came along. She claimed that I was trying to replace her in her daughter's life. That's when my wife walked into the room. She had been in the other room, but clearly, she'd been listening. She tried to mediate, saying that we just wanted some respect for our space. But her mom wouldn't let up. The conversation turned into a full-blown argument, with my mother-in-law insisting that her own daughter had been brainwashed by me. Then came the bombshell. My mother-in-law turned to my wife and said she needed to make a choice. Either she would stand by her mother or keep living by my rules. Caught both of us off guard. My wife was stunned, but she took a deep breath, then told her mother that she was sticking by me and that we were a team. It was the first time she'd made such a strong statement in front of her mom, and I could tell it took a lot for her to say it. My mother-in-law looked furious. She got up, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I just sat there for a moment trying to process what had happened. My wife was visibly shaken, but she hugged me, saying that she didn't regret standing up for us, even though it hurt to see her mother like that. The next day, the fallout began. My phone started buzzing with texts from various family members. Some were just checking in, wanting to know what had happened, while others were more accusatory, saying they couldn't believe I'd put my wife in a position where she had to choose between her mother and her husband. It was clear that my mother-in-law had been talking to everyone about what went down. That same day, she made a post on social media. It was one of those vague but not so vague rants about selfish people tearing families apart and how some children forget where they come from. Of course, everyone in the family could tell who she was talking about. It didn't take long for aunts, uncles, and cousins to start commenting with supportive messages, sending their love and saying how strong she was for dealing with so much. My wife saw the post and was visibly upset. She didn't know whether to respond or ignore it. I could see that this was tearing her apart, being caught between me and her mother. And now, with extended family members taking sides, it was only getting worse. We tried to focus on our daily lives, but the tension was always there, like a cloud hanging over us. Not long after, my mother-in-law ramped up her campaign, calling up other relatives and telling them her version of events. I found out that she was saying I had isolated my wife, that I was trying to take over all the family traditions, and that I didn't respect her place in the family. Some relatives started distancing themselves from us, and one of the biggest blows came when we found out we were no longer invited to a family gathering we'd always attended. It turned out that my mother-in-law had told the hosts that she wouldn't come if we were going to be there, and since no one wanted the drama, they uninvited us instead. It hurt to see my wife so upset by this. She'd grown up with these people, and now they were siding with her mom without even asking for our side of the story. That was the last straw for my wife. She called her mother and, for the first time, she let her have it. She told her that what she was doing was hurtful and unfair, that all we had asked for was a little respect for our space, and that this ongoing drama was pushing her away more than any boundary ever could. My mother-in-law didn't take it well. There was a lot of yelling on the other end, but my wife stood her ground. After the call, there was a silence that settled between us. It felt like a weight had been lifted, but it also left a lot of uncertainty. We knew things weren't going to get easier anytime soon, but at least we were facing it together. And as the calls and texts from the extended family kept coming, I realized this was just the beginning of the fallout from our attempt to draw a line in the sand. Update 2. After my wife confronted her mother over the phone, we thought things might cool down, but instead, my mother-in-law took things to a whole new level. A few days later, she created a family group chat. The title was something dramatic like Family Matters, and it didn't take long to see what she had in mind. Her first message was a long, emotional rant about how she felt shut out of our lives, how she couldn't understand why her daughter would let someone come between them, and how she was heartbroken that she couldn't even visit her child's home without a permission slip. I could feel my phone buzzing constantly as messages poured in. My mother-in-law kept going, accusing me of manipulating her daughter and turning her against her own mother. She wrote that she had always been there for her daughter, and now she was being treated like an outsider. It was hard to read, but I knew I couldn't just ignore it. So, I took a deep breath and responded, trying to keep things as calm as possible. I wrote that we weren't trying to push anyone away and that the boundary was simply about privacy in our new home. I emphasized that this was a decision we made together as a couple, not something I forced. My message didn't go over well with everyone. The group chat quickly turned into a battleground. Some relatives sided with me, saying that my mother-in-law needed to respect our boundaries, that it wasn't unreasonable to ask for some space, especially in a new home. But others weren't having it. They argued that my mother-in-law had every right to see her daughter whenever she wanted and that I had no place to set these kinds of rules. The chat was buzzing nonstop with messages, and it was clear that no one was backing down. In the middle of this chaos, my wife finally lost her patience. She left a message in the chat saying that she was tired of all the drama, that she just wanted everyone to respect our decisions in our marriage. Then she left the group altogether. I followed her lead, leaving the chat too. It felt like the only way to stop the back and forth. But my mother-in-law wasn't done. That same evening, she posted a long, emotional status on social media. It was a public cry for sympathy, talking about how she was losing her child and how some people had come between her and her family. She wrote about how she'd always tried to be a good mother but now was being pushed away. It didn't take much to figure out who she was talking about, and it quickly turned into a spectacle. Her friends and some extended family members flooded the comments with messages of support, telling her to stay strong and saying how they couldn't believe how she was being treated. That post brought even more fallout. My wife and I started getting messages from friends, some asking if everything was okay, and others suggesting that maybe we should be more understanding of my mother-in-law's feelings. It felt like every time we opened our phones, there was another message, another reminder that this situation was far from over. We had to keep explaining ourselves, which only made things more exhausting. It was around this time that my wife suggested we see a therapist. She thought it might help us navigate everything, maybe give us some tools to deal with the constant pressure from her mother and the family drama. I agreed, hoping that it might at least help us figure out a way to move forward together. We brought up the idea of family therapy to my mother-in-law, thinking maybe it could help all of us get on the same page. But she shot it down immediately, saying she wasn't the one with the problem and that she didn't need therapy to understand that she was being pushed out of her own family. With every passing week, the stress of the situation started to weigh on me. I could feel it in my body, tension headaches, sleepless nights, that constant feeling like I was walking on eggshell 7 in my own home. My wife tried to keep me focused on our life together, but the ongoing drama made it hard to find any peace. Then came a breaking point. My wife decided to draw a line in the sand. She called her mother and told her that we wouldn't be attending any family events unless I was welcome too. She made it clear that we were a package deal and that if my mother-in-law couldn't respect that, then we would need to take a step back from these gatherings. My mother-in-law didn't take it well. She started crying, then switched to anger, saying that her own daughter was choosing me over her. And then she did something unexpected. She called my parents. She tried to get them involved, hoping they would pressure me to back down. But my parents told her they respected our decision as a couple and that it wasn't their place to interfere. It was a relief to know they had my back. But it only seemed to make my mother-in-law more determined. Surprisingly, one of my wife's aunts reached out to me privately. She'd been quiet throughout the whole thing, but now she called to say she'd seen this behavior before. Apparently, my mother-in-law had a history of stirring up drama when she didn't get her way, and the aunt wanted us to know we weren't alone. It was a small comfort in the middle of everything else. But things flared up again when my mother-in-law showed up at our house unannounced. She claimed she wanted to talk things out and tried to act like she was there in good faith. But within minutes, the conversation took a turn, and it became clear she was still upset about the boundaries. My wife and I tried to stay calm, but my mother-in-law kept pushing, saying that we'd isolated her and that she couldn't believe we'd cut her off from family events. That's when my wife finally snapped. She told her mother that if she couldn't respect our household and our decisions, then she wouldn't be welcome there anymore. My mother-in-law's face went pale, and she looked like she might start crying. She grabbed her things and left without another word, tears welling up in her eyes as she walked out the door. Later that night, my mother-in-law made another social media post. This time, she directly named me. She called me cold-hearted and accused me of tearing a family apart. It was public, brutal, and all too familiar by now. The comments started rolling in again, and the family drama hit a new peak. It was a mess, and we had no idea how to make it stop. Update 3. After my mother-in-law's latest social media post, where she called me cold-hearted, things escalated quickly. Within hours, a few family members reached out directly. Their messages were a mix of disappointment and disbelief. One cousin said they couldn't believe I'd treat my mother-in-law this way, calling me heartless for making her feel unwelcome. Another told me that they expected better from me, given how close the family used to be. But then the tide began to shift. Some relatives who had stayed silent until now started messaging me, sharing a different perspective. They told me that while they'd initially sided with my mother-in-law, her public outbursts were starting to feel excessive. One of my wife's uncles even said that it wasn't fair for her to air out personal grievances on social media like that. He admitted that it looked like my mother-in-law was just trying to turn the whole family against us. It was a small comfort, knowing that not everyone bought into her narrative. A week later, my mother-in-law reached out again. But this time it wasn't through a call or text. She sent out an invitation for a family meeting at her house. The message was framed as a way to clear the air and address misunderstandings. My wife showed me the invite, and we both hesitated. I had a bad feeling about it, worried that it might turn into a public shaming session. But my wife insisted that we go together. She wanted us to show up as a united front, hoping that maybe it would force her mother to see that we were serious about our boundaries. Reluctantly, I agreed. The day of the meeting came, and as soon as we arrived, I knew it was going to be rough. My mother-in-law had gathered about a dozen relatives, uncles, aunts, cousins, all crammed into her living room. She wasted no time, launching into a speech about how she had been pushed out of her own family, how she felt like an outsider in her daughter's life, and how it was all because of new rules that I had imposed. She pointed at me, claiming that I was the one driving a wedge between her and her child. For a while, I just sat there, letting her rant. But then my wife stood up. She told everyone that the boundaries were a joint decision, that I wasn't forcing anything on her, and that we simply wanted a little privacy. It was the first time she had defended me so openly in front of the whole family. I could see the shock on my mother-in-law's face. She clearly hadn't expected her daughter to take my side so publicly. That's when my mother-in-law broke down. She started crying, talking about how she just wanted things to go back to the way they were, how she missed being Placido, her daughter. She turned to the other relatives, asking them if they would accept this kind of disrespect in their homes, trying to rally them against us. Some of them looked sympathetic, but others seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. Then, the aunt who had reached out to us earlier stepped in. She suggested that if the family really cared about my wife's happiness, maybe they should respect her choices, even if they didn't fully understand them. She reminded everyone that boundaries weren't meant to hurt anyone. They were about making sure everyone's relationships stayed healthy. I could see my mother-in-law's expression change when the aunt spoke up. She turned on her, accusing her of taking my side, of betraying the family. The tension in the room got thick, and you could feel the unease settling over everyone. My wife took a deep breath, and in a calm voice, told her mother that if she couldn't respect our boundaries, we would have to limit our interactions with her. She made it clear that this wasn't an ultimatum we wanted to give, but it was the only way we could maintain any sense of peace in our own home. My mother-in-law stared at her, clearly shocked that her daughter would stand firm. For a moment, there was total silence in the room. No one seemed to know what to say. Eventually, relatives started shuffling out, muttering awkward goodbyes. Some of them offered us encouraging words as they left, while others stuck close to my mother-in-law, offering her comfort. The meeting had ended without any real resolution. But as my wife and I drove home, we felt strangely closer. We knew this was far from over, but at least we had faced it together. After the meeting, my mother-in-law went silent. No calls, no texts, no cryptic social media posts, just silence. Weeks went by, and the absence of drama felt strange. My wife and I tried to make the most of it, focusing on our relationship and trying to enjoy the newfound calm. We went for walks, caught up on shows we'd been meaning to watch, and even had a few peaceful dinners without any interruptions. But beneath it all, there was a lingering anxiety. It felt like the calm before the storm, and we couldn't shake the feeling that my mother-in-law might be planning something. The silence stretched on, and part of us wondered if maybe she had finally decided to respect our wishes. But after everything that had happened, it was hard to trust that this would be the end of it. We just kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing that if my mother-in-law had proven anything, it was that she wasn't ready to let go without a fight. And so, we braced ourselves, trying to enjoy the peace while it lasted, but always with one eye on the horizon, waiting to see what would come next. Update 4. Weeks of silence passed, and just when my wife and I started to think maybe things were truly settling down, my mother-in-law resurfaced. She called my wife first with a different tone than before. Instead of the usual tension, she sounded remorseful, saying she realized she had taken things too far and that she wanted to make amends. She asked if she could come over to talk things out in person. My wife seemed hopeful, thinking maybe her mother had a change of heart. But I wasn't so sure. I couldn't help but feel that there was something else going on. Still, for my wife's sake, I agreed to the visit. When my mother-in-law arrived, she came with flowers and a tray of her signature casserole. She tried to create a warm, almost nostalgic atmosphere, like she was trying to remind us of better times. She sat down with us in the living room, and the first thing she did was apologize. She talked about how she'd let her emotions get the best of her, how she regretted making everything so public, and how she just wanted to find a way to move forward. But as she spoke, there was something rehearsed about it. Like she'd practiced this apology before stepping through our door. She kept emphasizing how misunderstood she'd been, how she never meant to hurt anyone, subtly casting herself as the victim in the situation. I stayed polite but guarded, accepting her apology but making it clear that our boundaries weren't going anywhere. That seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, there was a flicker of irritation in her eyes, but she quickly replaced it with a smile. She nodded and said she understood, though I noticed her gaze kept drifting around the house, like she was looking for something. It made me uneasy, but I didn't mention it at the time. My wife, on the other hand, seemed genuinely relieved. She thought that maybe we were finally turning a corner with her mother, that this could be the first step toward mending the relationship. My mother-in-law must have sensed this, because she took the opportunity to suggest a reconciliation dinner at her place, inviting the whole family. She framed it as a way to bring everyone together again, to show that we were moving past the drama. I had a bad feeling about it, but my wife wanted to go, so I reluctantly agreed. On the night of the dinner, my mother-in-law greeted us with an overly cheerful attitude. The house was decorated with fresh flowers, and she had prepared a big meal with everyone's favorite dishes. It almost felt like a holiday gathering, with everyone trying to be on their best behavior. But as the dinner progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that my mother-in-law was steering the conversation in a particular direction. She kept dropping little comments about how everyone makes mistakes and how forgiveness is key in a strong family. It was clear she was trying to guide the family's perception, painting herself as someone who was ready to move on, if only everyone else would do the same. Then, toward the end of the night, my mother-in-law stood up and announced that she had a special gift for my wife and me. She handed us a framed photo of my wife as a child, smiling with her mother. Tucked inside the frame was a handwritten note about the importance of family love, and how no one should let outside influences come between them. The message was subtle but unmistakable. It suggested that the boundaries we'd set were somehow undermining the family's bond. I watched my wife's face as she read the note, and I could see the realization dawn on her. The apology, the dinner, the gift. It all seemed like another attempt to manipulate the situation and win sympathy from the rest of the family. She looked at me, and I could tell she was starting to see through her mother's act. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I asked my mother-in-law directly why she kept bringing up the idea of family dynamics and mistakes if she truly respected our decision to set boundaries. The room went silent. All eyes turned to us. My mother-in-law's smile faded, and her cheerful demeanor quickly gave way to frustration. She tried to turn it back on me, accusing me of being unforgiving, of holding on to resentment. She claimed that no matter how hard she tried, I would always see her as the enemy. It quickly turned into a tense exchange, with my mother-in-law raising her voice and insisting that I was the one keeping the family apart. She told everyone that she had tried everything to make things right, but that I was too stubborn to let go of the past. My wife stepped in, trying to calm things down, but it was too late. My mother-in-law had already let her mask slip. She turned to the other relatives, seeking validation, but instead of backing her up, most of them looked uncomfortable, unsure of what to say. Realizing she wasn't getting the reaction she hoped for, my mother-in-law grabbed her purse and made a dramatic exit, claiming that she couldn't stand to see her family torn apart like this anymore. She left the house, slamming the door behind her, leaving the rest of us sitting around the table in awkward silence. As we drove home that night, my wife squeezed my hand, and we both knew that whatever hope we'd had for a peaceful resolution with her mother was gone. The dinner had only exposed how deeply entrenched my mother-in-law's need for control really was. And as much as we wanted to move forward, it was clear that my mother-in-law wasn't ready to let go of her grudge anytime soon. Update 5. After the disaster at the reconciliation dinner, my wife and I knew we needed to take a step back from my mother-in-law. The constant drama was taking a toll on both of us, and we decided that for the sake of our mental health, it was time to draw a hard line. My wife reached out to her mother and calmly explained that we were going to take a break from contact for a while, just until things settled down. It wasn't an easy call, and I could hear the tension in her voice as she spoke. My mother-in-law didn't take it well. Within minutes, she was calling my wife's phone repeatedly, leaving tearful voicemails accusing her of abandoning her real family and choosing me over the people who had raised her. She kept insisting that I was driving a wedge between them and that my wife needed to open her eyes to what was really happening. But this time, my wife held firm. She told her mother that we couldn't keep doing this cycle of drama, that we needed time and space until she could respect our boundaries. She said we wouldn't be engaging with her. As expected, my mother-in-law's response came swiftly on social media. She posted a long, bitter message directly calling me out. She accused me of brainwashing her child, of tearing apart a once happy family, and painted herself as a heartbroken mother being unjustly shut out of her daughter's life. It was one of those public posts designed to gather sympathy, and sure enough, the comments started pouring in, with some friends and family expressing their outrage and support for my mother-in-law. But this time, there were also people who spoke up against it. Some of the extended family members who had reached out to us before started sending private messages again. They told us they had seen my mother-in-law's post and thought she had gone too far. A few even left comments directly on her post, suggesting that maybe there was more to the story than what she was sharing. It felt like the tide was turning, with more people seeing through her tactics. It didn't change the fact that the situation was painful, but at least we weren't the only ones seeing it for what it was. The fallout from the post caused a lot of tension, but there was also a sense of relief. My wife and I could finally focus on each other, without the constant worry of what my mother-in-law might do next. She decided it was time to start therapy to work through the guilt and frustration she felt about distancing herself from her mother. I joined her for a few couple sessions, and it ended up being one of the best decisions we made. We learned how to communicate better, how to support each other through all the external pressures, and it brought us closer than ever. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law seemed to retreat into her own bubble. She stopped reaching out to us entirely and even began refusing invitations to family events where she knew we'd be present. It was strange to see her pulling away like that, especially since she had fought so hard to stay involved before. But without her constant presence, we started to feel like we could breathe again. Then, out of nowhere, one of my wife's cousins showed up at our door. He seemed a bit nervous, but after a few minutes of small talk, he revealed what had brought him over. Apparently, my mother-in-law had been spinning a new story to the rest of the family. She had been telling people that I was the reason my wife wasn't reconnecting with her. She'd been saying that my wife was desperate to repair their relationship, but that I was keeping her from reaching out. It was frustrating to hear, but we decided not to engage with it. We had our own life to focus on, and if my mother-in-law wanted to create a new narrative, we weren't going to play into it. A few months later, my wife decided to try reaching out to her mother again. She hoped that some time apart might have helped cool things down, that maybe there was a chance they could rebuild some kind of relationship. She sent a simple message, checking in and asking if my mother-in-law would be open to talking. The response came quickly, but it wasn't what we hoped for. My mother-in-law's reply was cold, distant, like she was speaking to a stranger. She kept things brief, making it clear that she had no intention of moving past what had happened. After that, my wife finally started to accept that their relationship might never go back to what it once was. It wasn't an easy realization, but she found comfort in the fact that we had come out of this stronger together. We had built a life that made us happy, and even though it came with its share of challenges, we were finally on the same page about what we wanted. In the end, it seemed like my mother-in-law found a new target for her attention. We started hearing from other relatives that she was getting involved in their lives, offering unsolicited advice and trying to insert herself into their family matters. My wife and I couldn't help but feel a bit of relief, knowing that her focus had shifted elsewhere. It seemed like she needed to have some kind of influence over someone's life, and if it wasn't going to be ours, she'd find another place to exert control. With my mother-in-law's focus elsewhere, peace finally returned to our home. We settled into a new routine, and it felt like we were reclaiming parts of our life that had been overshadowed by the drama. The tension wasn't completely gone, but we had learned how to manage it, and we had each other's backs. We realized that setting boundaries, as painful as it had been, was the right decision for our relationship. And for the first time in a long while, things were starting to feel normal again.